Thanks all for being here today. I think we're going to have a fairly large viewership online as well, so thanks to those of you who are watching via our webcast. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia and a professor here at the School of International Public Affairs. I'm really glad you're all here today, both in person and virtually, and really glad our speakers are here today. The issue of fugitive methane is a hugely important issue. Obviously, the question of natural gas, the boom in shale gas, and what implication that has for U.S. energy policy is at the top of the agenda right now. And the issue of methane leakage is getting a lot of attention because much of the policy discussion is premised on a view that natural gas is roughly half the greenhouse gas emissions relative to coal for power generation. Obviously, there are a host of other issues for gas with economic issues, geopolitical issues, local pollution benefits, but the climate issue is very important, and it's generated a lot of attention. And there's a lot of numbers out there and a lot of conflicting, in some cases, studies out there. So I'm really glad we have this new report and that EDF is here today to present it. When Secretary Ernie Moniz was here a few weeks ago, we had the vast plurality of questions that he received that we asked people to write on cards were all about shale gas and potential concerns people had with it, and in particular the issue of fugitive methane more than almost any other concern that people have with the rest of hydraulic fracturing and the whole shale development process. When I was in the administration, Secretary Chu asked his Secretary of Energy Advisory Board to look at issues around shale gas. They produced a report that was quite useful, I think, and one of those members was Fred Krupp, the president of Environmental Defense Fund. And one of the issues they identified as a potential concern with shale development was the issue of methane leakage and how to minimize that and actually ensure that natural gas does have lower greenhouse gas emissions. So I give Fred a lot of credit for actually then not just making a recommendation, but doing something about it, and taking a lot of time and a lot of resources for EDF to work with leading scientists, to work with people in industry, and really try to produce data so we actually know what the leakage rates are. Since the study came out, there have been lots of reporting, lots of headlines. Like most things in energy debates, it tends to be a little simplified, and people who already have pre-existing views on either side that natural gas is great or natural gas is awful kind of both pick up the study and use it to make their points. And so we thought it was particularly helpful to have the actual people here who did the science come and actually tell us exactly what the report says, what it doesn't say, and what the implications might be for the role of natural gas in U.S. future energy policy. So we're really happy that our guests are here today. Those guests are Dr. Stephen Hamburg from Environmental Defense Fund. He's their chief scientist, their public voice for all the work they do, with a very strong commitment to science-based advocacy and scientific integrity in EDF's positions and programs. He has served as an advisor to both corporations and NGOs, was awarded the Environmental Merit Award by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for his climate change activities, has published widely in journals like Nature and Science, served as a lead author on the IPCC. And then Mark Brownstein, Associate Vice President and Chief Counsel of U.S. Energy and Climate Program at EDF. He leads EDF's natural gas efforts. We worked very closely with him when I was in government, and he was just a really extraordinary person to bring good evidence-based facts to a lot of the questions that we had and wanted to work with him on. So the work he does, I think, is incredibly valuable to public policy process. Mark was Director of Enterprise Strategy for PSEG before that, before he joined EDF, where he worked directly with its senior leadership in crafting and implementing the corporation's business strategy, and before that was an attorney in private environmental practice and a regulator with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So I want to thank them both for being here and ask Dr. Hamburg to please come up. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And it's great. What Jason didn't say is I spent the first part of my career, the first 25 years in academia, and actually heading the environment program at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University during the last part of my career. So it's sort of great to be kind of home. I want to start by trying to set the stage, thinking about methane as a broad issue, and then we're going to shift to the study that was released. And I just want to stress at the beginning, the paper that came out now 2 weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science is one small piece of a much larger effort. So one of the things that we don't want to get into is the study is definitive on X, as opposed to it's the first building block of a much larger effort that we've undertaken, and I'm sure it'll go beyond that. They're worrying about the mic. They're going to tether a professor to the podium. That's always a hard thing. So particularly, all right, I have to look at it here because I can't see it. So, all right, so let's see. All right, what do I hit? There we go. So the first thing that we want to look at is the climate implications of methane versus CO2. Now, this is on a molecule-by-molecule basis. Now, the reason I'm going to go a little bit slow, that we've got roughly half an hour of presentation, so we should have lots of time for questions. But there's a lot of confusion because people are mixing up different facts. They're both correct, but when you put them together, you get tremendous confusion. So on a molecular basis, methane is 26 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. So if we simply put a molecule up of CO2 and methane, it's 26 times more potent. Remember. And methane, however, decays in the atmosphere much more quickly. So I don't have a pointer that I can use. But if you look on the left axis, you have the fraction remaining, starting with 100%, going down to 0. You have years on the x-axis, the y-axis. You have years on the x-axis. And what you see is that methane in the atmosphere, by the time 50 years rolls around, is largely gone. And but remember, the methane becomes CO2. It breaks down and becomes CO2. The CO2 has a similar initial decay in that it's taken up by the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere, but then what's left remains for a very long time, centuries. So one, you put in the atmosphere, it's very potent, but it decays, converting into CO2. The other one dissipates and then remains for a long period of time. So the net result of that is that when we look at the global warming potential, how much impact will emitting methane have over time relative to the net radiative forcing? How much will it increase the amount of energy trapped at the surface of the Earth? It's a dynamic curve. It's not a single point. It's got a temporal component. So initially, now this is on a kilogram by kilogram basis. This is part of the confusion, is that people present different numbers and people think one's right, one's wrong. They're both right. They're just different ways of looking at it. So on a kilogram per kilogram basis, which is the way that it's usually looked at, but they don't have the same molecular weight, so that's why it matters here. It's 72 times more potent at 20 years, 25 times more potent at 100 years. There is some recent work using more indirect impacts that could put it as high as 105 and 33. It changes the mass some, but it doesn't change the underlying sort of science and principles that we need to deal with. So this is all way of background. We're just trying to understand what we're dealing with because it matters. We don't just care about what's out in 100 years, which was the traditional way of doing it. We just looked at the 100-year impact. But we don't just care about the 20-year impact. We care about both. We care about the whole curve. So we published a paper now a year and a half ago that tried to really look at what were the implications of different amounts of methane leaking from the natural gas supply chain relative to fuel switching. So if I drove, when I was at Brown, a natural gas van. I would go out on all my field trips. I'm a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist. I like taking people out in the field. And I used a natural gas van. Well, one of the things that I got thinking about early several years ago was, well, what are the implications if there was a small leak? Those of you in the university know if the fleet van has a leak, you'd never know and no one else would know because basically as long as it isn't leaking most of the gas, you're happy. So how much impact would that have? And was it a good decision 15 years ago when we got rid of our gas vehicle and went to natural gas as an environmental move? So what you see here is on the y-axis, the percent of natural gas leakage from the supply chain, and then at the bottom, the years until climate benefits are achieved. And this is for fuel switching. So if we have a coal power plant and we want to switch it to natural gas, just from an analytical standpoint, using those curves I just showed you in the math, you can create these curves which show you at what percentage leakage you'll get a climate benefit at what point in time. So if you're only worried about 100 years, you could be leaking more than 6%. But if you care about immediately getting benefit, it's 3.2%. Does everybody follow that? Because that's an important concept, because there's this temporal. And when you do a gasoline, which is the case of the van, from gasoline to natural gas, it's 1.6%, and diesel heavy-duty vehicles, it's 1%. So 1% became our target at EDF to ensure that if we go to a natural gas economy, we're getting climate benefit from day one moving forward. Now, that's the minimum. Obviously, we want to minimize methane leakage because we want to extract all the potential increase in net radiative forcing out of the economy as we possibly can. But that's the analytical frame. We publish that as the starting place for the work I'm about to describe. So we put the sort of intellectual framework into a publication. It was transparent. People could see what we're thinking. As global background, we need to think about the importance of methane and short-lived forcers relative to the larger question. So on the right is the traditional way you'd look at it, is the 100-year greenhouse gas impacts on the climate. And you would see that the short-lived forcers, mainly methane, but also F-gases and black carbon, account for about 16% of the net radiative forcing today and what it'll have its impact 100 years. But if we use the 20-year version, and again, we want to do all versions, what we see is these short-term, these potent short-lived forcers account for about a third of the climate change we're experiencing. So they're having a big impact on our climate over the short to medium term, and over the long term, we care most about CO2. Bottom line here, it's an and. We need to deal with short-term forcers and carbon. It's both. You don't get a solution with one or the other, or at least not the short and long term. So then the other thing to think about is what happens to natural gas if we are faced with this. So you see here, I apologize, I don't have a pointer. You see the methane molecule on the left. If it's flared, it's one molecule of CO2. If it's emitted to the atmosphere, again, you get this increased radiative forcing. So you want to reduce that. So what's our approach? First thing was there was a real dearth of data about methane leakage from the natural gas supply chain. I characterized it in the press. It's a he said, she said, they said, we said problem. It was unresolvable. There wasn't enough data to bring enough clarity to understand the situation. So first thing is we needed to understand, we need to acquire the data. Then we understand where the leaks are, so then we can develop the effective regulations to minimize leaks. And I'll turn it over at that point to Mark, who can talk about that piece. To do that, we set up what I believe is an unprecedented series of studies in which we're currently working with more than 90 collaborators in academia and the corporate sector and the research community more broadly to look at methane leakage across the entire supply chain. We divided it into 4 modules: well pads, which I'll talk about the first study that was released today. And then when it leaves the well pad, it goes into something called gathering lines. You've got to pull that gas all together, take it to a processing plant where you can clean it up to product, because you receive here in New York City natural gas that's almost exclusively methane, and all the other stuff's been taken out, part because it's product that can be sold, part of it is it's contaminants. So the next phase is the gathering lines and the processing. It then, to get it from wherever it's produced to New York, you're going to need to have transmission, high-pressure transmission lines. And because demand is so much higher in the winter than the summer, you want to have some storage and buffer capacity because you don't want the production to can't modulate that way. So you have storage. So the third module is transmission and storage. And the fourth one is the local distribution, the low-pressure pipes that are running through the streets of basically every city in America. We added a 5th module, which is an end use, a single end use. We didn't look at most end uses, on natural gas vehicles and fueling. Harkens back to the story I told you about that van that I drove all those years at Brown. It turns out there's very, very little data on natural gas leakage. So the problem was, how could we understand, here's this nascent use for gas, big policy question facing us to which we have essentially no data. So we felt that it was important to get ahead of that and really start to collect some quantitative data so we could understand natural gas methane leakage from that particular end use. We recognize there are additional end uses that have issues. We didn't address them in the study. You'll see on the top are a series of dates of when we hope that the reports will be approved by the steering committee or the scientists involved in that. That's not the publication date. Come back to that in a minute. They are sort of a series in parallel, but not, they're staggered in their start times because undertaking this much science this quickly was not possible to do it all on day one. I'll talk about the structure of the studies in a minute. So the attributes of these studies, they're all led by academic researchers. So it's science up front. We're deploying multiple methods so that we can look at it different ways. I'll talk about it with the well pad production study from the University of Texas. We have flyovers as well as bottom up. So we can compare. Does method A and B give us the same result? If not, why are they different? Or try and figure out why they differ. External peer review. There are folks looking over the shoulder of the research and making sure, are you doing it the best way, or making sure everything goes smoothly. Released through peer-reviewed journals. So when I had told you before in the last one, the dates that are up there, that's when it's sort of supposed to go out to the journal. Then all bets are off. For those of you who publish, I discovered it with this PNAS paper that came out at the University of Texas. We had requested an expedited review, not a changed review, not a less review, just try and make sure the reviewers know this is really topical, so make sure you get the reviews in. I say that I've been bugged the last 2 weeks by an editor for a review that I've been slow in getting back to a journal. So I understand the pressure. The bottom line is that it took longer to get it through the review process and publish than we wanted. So these are the dates when it's finished. It goes out to the peer review. Now, the importance of that is we want to make sure there's as much vetting of the science as possible before it's released. So that it's the best way we know how. And the last and critically important piece is all the data is made public. So anyone else can pick up the results and reanalyze them and say, I think you came to the wrong conclusion, or there's a subtlety, or there's more insight to be had. Point is, it's informing the public debate about the science so that we end up with the strongest set of data that gives the most insight rather than just the bottom line conclusions. This relationship with all of these different modules, with an NGO at the center, with the vast number of academic researchers, and I don't know the results of any of these studies. If I'm not a PI on them, I'm not involved in the data, just as others are. The research team has responsibility for collecting the data, analyzing the data. We'll see a draft to comment on just to bring our insight to it, but the full responsibility for the paper, its content, is with the academic researchers. That allows, and our partnership allows the researchers to get direct access to sites, which is critically important. You can measure things remotely, but you can't test. You need to both do it on-site and remotely and compare them if you really want to be sure you understand the meaning of the measurements. And in a lot of cases, we're making measurements on things that have never been measured before. So we're getting to look at the full spectrum in a way that hadn't happened before. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the University of Texas study. Focuses on the well pad only. So despite the headlines, there's no supply chain conclusion we can draw because we've only looked at the first piece of it. And using one study, and we have multiple studies in this field. It involved an enormous, so this study in total was about $2.3 million. It involved a lot of very difficult measurements. And here you get some pictures of the kinds of equipment sitting on the well pad that you had to try and figure out where the methane was coming from. So you see these big tenting efforts, and there's just enormous amount of effort to pull this together. This is not a trivial, and in a lot of cases, no one had done it before, so they had to develop the methods. That's where external peer review was critical. So while it was going on, there were people looking over their shoulders. Is that going to work? Is it not going to work? So people could really make sure that they felt comfortable they were doing it as best as we knew how. It was done geographically diverse. We don't want to just characterize a place. The very useful work happens at a single place. The trouble is we don't know how to put that place in the broader context until we collect lots of places. What we're trying to do in all of the studies is any place-based work is complemented by broader geographical work so we understand the context in which it's happening. So they did 4 large geographies that account for most of the production of natural gas in the U.S. Now some of the results. The study focused most heavily on something called completion flowbacks. So after you frack the well, you're taking out the fluids and the solids are left, getting that back, and making it possible for the gas to flow. In the process of doing that, which is why it's called completion flowbacks, it was hypothesized, but no one had met it, that a lot of emissions were coming out from the well. So that was sort of, for lack of better terms, a large burp from the system. So the very first, that had not been measured on hydraulic fracturing before. EPA in their 2011 estimates of emissions had estimated that nationally it was roughly 650 gigagrams of emissions. So they went out to 27 wells, developing some of this new technology, geographically dispersed across the 9 participating companies, and those 9 companies were responsible for drilling half the wells in 2011, new wells in 2011 in the U.S. So while it's not the entire population of companies, which is several thousand, it represents a large slice of the companies. And they looked at how much emissions were coming from those completion flowbacks. What they found is that the EPA's estimate of the potential emissions was very similar to what they found. So how much actual gas was coming out during this period was essentially the same as EPA's. But through the deployment of reduced emissions completions technology, they were able to capture 99% of it. Now that's the good news story, is that the regs under EPA require that equipment now be deployed. They didn't have to be deployed. It wasn't in 2011 when EPA did its estimate. So it's not inconsistent with EPA. It's just showing with the deployment of the new technology that's now required, that technology is extremely effective at capturing that burp of gas that comes out through the completion of the well. So the estimate from the University of Texas, 2/3 of them used this technology, and the other third had very low potential emissions due to the nature of the gas, the geology, the flow rates. Their potential emissions were small. So this was good news. The regs as they stand are effective when they're deployed, the equipment. Now we go to pneumatics. EPA estimated the emissions. Now these are pressure-activated valves, things that are using the pressure of the gas. So by nature they vent, because you're using the pressure. You have to release that pressure to keep activating it. You have to take the pressure on, off. To release that pressure, you vent it to the atmosphere. So these pneumatics, is estimated in 2011 by the EPA, was roughly 400 gigagrams, and yet the University of Texas emissions are 50% higher. So there was a lot more emissions measured by the University of Texas on 500 wells across the United States. So 27 completions, 150 well pads, roughly 500 wells. A well pad increasingly has more than one well on it because of the efficiencies of drilling and going in different directions. So now we've got greater releases than we thought from the EPA estimate from these pneumatic devices. And equipment, there's lots of different equipment on a well pad. These are complicated places. Also leaked almost 70% more than, or about 50% more than was estimated by the EPA. So we have, in effect, the regs are working and bringing emissions down, and in other parts, just on the well pad, of those 500 wells, 150 well pads, the emissions associated with the activities were higher than EPA had estimated. The bottom line on the far right, you see the estimate of the emissions. This is the absolute flux of gas, gigagrams per year, is different, statistically the same as what EPA estimated in 2011. Now you see, they were estimating different amounts in different years. Part of it was the assumptions, because of the limited amount of empirical data, changed over time as they learned more. So it's not the fact that the emissions are going up and down, it's you're trying to make your models more robust. We got the same, the University of Texas got a very similar result. However, the sources were different than the EPA had envisioned, in part because these EPA data are from 2011. They made their measurements in 2012, where in October 2012, the RECs were actually were required. So the companies are bringing the new technology on board. So let's think about what that means for the natural gas supply chain. Bottom line, this is the first piece of a series of studies to know what the total amount of natural gas emissions are. And even in the production side, we have additional studies that will be coming out, doing flyovers, so using an integrated measure of methane emissions and matching it up against the bottom up, the kind of study I just described. And we can compare them. In theory, they should give us the same number. So Dave Allen and his team found 0.42%, essentially the same as EPA. But one caution, we need to be very careful in using percentages. Doing the analysis using the same numbers, and I'll go all the way back, these are flux. This is actual mass. When you determine a percentage, you have to be very careful because it has a numerator and a denominator. If you don't use the same numerator and denominator, you get a different percentage. It's not wrong, it's just different. We got a lot of different numbers out there. I like to call it a fruit salad. We got a great pear and a great apple and a great kiwi, but they're not the same. So you have to be very careful when someone says there's a flyover number of X versus a bottom-up number of Y, and you expect they should be the same. Well, no, you have to ask, what are the percentages measuring to be sure that you're getting the correct comparisons? So 0.42 is reported. The way we did it in our initial paper, what I talked about with I showed you those graphs of where the break-even point, where is it better for fuel switching for the climate at any point in time, is using a slightly different numerator. And it's actually just, again, all the same data. We're not changing anything Allen reports. We're just doing it consistently the way we did the calculation of the 1%, then it's 0.53%. And those other percentages are EPA's estimate using those same characteristics. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark here. That's just the first piece. As one reporter said, so you're just teasing me. I said, I'm afraid I guess I am. All right? So don't believe the headlines that say that the story's over. The story's just beginning. But for the first time, we start having really concrete numbers that show us clearly regulations can work, and there's more to be done, and there's a lot more to be done to minimize leakage so that we really can realize the carbon reduction potentials of natural gas versus other fossil fuels. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to talk about the policy implications of this.
So thank you, Steve. So when I talk about natural gas, people often ask me the question, so is this good or bad for the environment? And I often say, well, it's really a tale of two cities, right? It's the best of times, it's the worst of times, right? We're here today to talk about methane emissions. But to really understand natural gas's role in our nation's energy mix, right, it is important to take a step back and think about both the pluses and minuses of this fuel source, right? On the positive side, those of you who pay close attention to this know that last week, New York City announced that air pollution that has greatly decreased in the city, largely because of the city's efforts to convert all of these apartment buildings here from number 6 fuel oil to lower emission alternatives, such as biodiesel, such as natural gas. Right? We've seen a 69% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions in this city as a consequence of that policy change. 23% reduction in particulate matter as a result of that policy change. Right? So that is a tangible example of some of the benefits, right, that accrue from moving from dirtier sources of fossil fuels to cleaner sources of fossil fuels. But by the same token, right, we know all too well here in New York and elsewhere around the country that there are serious challenges associated with producing that new gas supply. Right? It's about the amount of water that's used in the production process. It's about the threats to groundwater that accrue from this production process, the land use impacts, and yes, the conventional air pollution challenges that exist at the well sites. All of those are very real issues, particularly to those communities that are most affected by production. So we're here today to talk about methane emissions, which is an incredibly important environmental challenge. But it's important to footnote, right, that the conversation about natural gas's role in our energy economy, right, requires a broad discussion of the variety of benefits and challenges that exist. But specific to the question of methane, as Steve notes, it's incredibly important to look at the entire value chain. Right? The work that we did in partnership with University of Texas is very much focused on methane emissions at the point of production. But to really understand what is the greenhouse gas impact of increased natural gas use or existing natural gas use, we really do need to think about not just what are the emissions at the point of production, right? But we also need to look at what they are through the value chain. The gathering and processing, which is basically taking the gas from all these disparate wells and bringing it together. And then essentially cleaning the gas, making it ready for delivery into the interstate pipe system. And then that interstate pipe system, right? And here it's not just about potential leaks along the pipelines, but it's also all the compressors that exist to get that gas from point A to point B. Then that gas is delivered to what's known as the city gate, right? Into the local distribution system, right? The pipes that exist underneath the city streets here in New York and elsewhere. All of that infrastructure plays a role in not only getting gas to you as the end customer, but also potential opportunities for emissions. And so our work over the next 12 to 18 months is to get a handle on the entire value chain. But that said, right, we don't need to know everything about leaks at every point in the value chain to know that there are already opportunities that exist in front of us to make improvements. And the UT study gives us not only great new data on what's actually happening at these production sites, but it's also giving us now a little bit of a roadmap as to what we can do now to improve the greenhouse gas profile of natural gas and reduce methane emissions today. So Steve mentioned that we saw that green completion technology was incredibly effective. Anywhere from 97 to 99% effective in controlling methane emissions, as he described it at that burping phase, in between from the time you drill the well to the time that you put it into full production. Okay, so that technology can be incredibly effective. And the good news is that EPA now requires, as of October of 2012, EPA now requires that green completion technology to be deployed for unconventional gas wells in the U.S. Those regulations become fully effective in January of 2015, but it's fair to say that what we saw in the field is that companies are already moving towards adopting this technology in anticipation of that January 2015 due date. That's the good news. The bad news is that these regulations don't apply to all forms of unconventional gas development that are going on today in the U.S. Right? Producers that are primarily producing oil, but where natural gas, methane, is associated with that oil production, are currently not required to implement this green completion technology. And yet, that is where the industry is most active these days, in places like the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas or the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. Right? These are what are known as associated gas plays, and these EPA green completion technology requirements don't apply there right now. So opportunity number one is we've got a very effective set of control technologies, as demonstrated by this study. And we would argue that there is an opportunity now to further improve the footprint of natural gas simply by adopting known effective technology across the full range of gas production that's taking place onshore in the U.S. today. Opportunity number one. Opportunity number two. Right? Steve talked about the pneumatics, right? These controllers. Okay? There is technology out there that would allow you to operate the valves either with minimal venting of methane, or in certain cases, technology that would exist that could operate these valves without using the pressure from the methane from the natural gas at all. Okay? Valves that use air, for example, compressed air. Okay? So we have alternative technologies out there, but we currently don't have any federal requirements to require the use of those alternative technologies. This is a big issue because we have not only new wells that are being developed, we've got a whole backlog of existing wells that are using this technology, and we can do better. So that's opportunity number two. Opportunity number three, the data shows that fugitive emissions, right, leaks, at the point of production are higher than what EPA or the industry estimated. Okay? Here again, not currently required under federal regulation to go out and find leaks and fix them, but simple enough to do. Pennsylvania has now a requirement that companies go out once a year and do that. And that's a good start. But I should note that what we saw as we were doing this work is that some of these leaks are things that are very simple, right? A worker might leave a hatch on a tank that otherwise is supposed to be sealed. Might leave that hatch open. We've seen cases where valves are not tightened. And this is not because there's a grand conspiracy theory here to pollute the environment. It's simply, as you imagine, it's the day in and day out blocking and tackling of maintenance and managing a workforce. And sometimes stuff gets missed. And so the thought is that if we could require companies to do a more thorough job, a more regular job of simply maintenance practices at these sites, we could achieve a substantial amount to reduce emissions at these sites. Very little additional capital. This is really about what incentives do you have to go out and monitor for leaks at your site, and to simply send your workers out there and fix the leaks that you then find. Okay. Let me then conclude with one thought about regulation, right? Because I've said throughout these three opportunities that these are opportunities for additional federal regulation. And so the question naturally comes, well, Mark, if this is methane, and methane is the product that companies are producing, isn't it in their economic interest to minimize the amount of methane that's lost at the production site? After all, the more they capture, the more they can sell. And yes, there is a certain logic to that. And certainly some companies have found that when they deploy these kinds of technologies, green completions, advanced leak detection and repair, low or no bleed pneumatic valves, that they actually see some kind of return on their investment because they have more gas to sell. Some of the more forward-thinking companies are seeing that. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that in the United States, the gas production industry is incredibly diffuse, made up of all sizes and shapes of players. And as a consequence, we have, depending on who you ask, 2,000, 3,000, up to 7,000 different producers. In fact, the fact that there's now one set number for how many producers out there just tell you, right, that this is not an industry that is easy to wrap your arms around. This is not like the auto industry where you can invite 3 companies in around a conference table, come to some sort of understanding with them, and watch them then implement the agreement, right? You can't get 3,000 to 7,000 players around a conference table. And yet, we need to make sure that all producers are living up to these standards, not only for environmental reasons, but because you don't want to create a perverse incentive where the guys and gals who are doing it right suffer a disbenefit because certain producers are cutting corners, right? Regulation is the only way we know that there's a common floor of behavior that everyone's going to meet. So that's the first thing. The second reason for regulation is that this is a margin business. And companies are looking for every dime, particularly now that gas prices are as low as they are. Okay. And so there is an incentive, okay, frankly, to cut corners. I said that there's a return on investment from natural gas, from capturing this natural gas, but it doesn't necessarily always meet a company's hurdle rate for capital deployment. And so although it may be profitable, it may not be profitable enough, and so the opportunity goes unrealized. That creates an externality, and as we all know, being here at public policy school, externalities are the reason why public policy exists and why regulation exists. And that's why we focus so much on regulation, to address this issue. And so with that, Steve and I would be happy to spend some time discussing this with you, answering any questions that you have.
You guys want to take a seat over here? I can just moderate from here, and we can take some questions. And so I will ask people to identify themselves, ask an actual question, not make a long speech or statement, and keep it brief so we can get as many in. I'll just ask one to kick it off, and then we'll open it up to everyone here. So if I heard you correctly, in the production phase, EPA in their most recent inventory got it about right, although where it comes from was actually different.
Correct.
If that is true for all the rest of their inventory, that would be good news in terms of how we think about the potential climate benefits, I think, of gas versus coal from a power generation standpoint. If that's wrong,
okay.
If that's wrong, let me know.
Yeah, so it's better news than some people believed. One other thing is that, as I mentioned, we are looking at the production study looked at the efforts of 9 companies who are responsible for a large percentage, roughly half of the drilling. We have to also be careful that are there other actors out there, and I'm not saying there are, but we need to look at the aggregate through these flyovers and other methods to see whether or not that there are higher emitters out there that weren't captured in the study, so that the aggregate, in fact, might be higher.
Right.
And we have studies ongoing to do that. So that's what I'm saying. We have to wait for that. So maybe the numbers from UT is exactly where we'll land, but there's a piece of it we don't know yet that we still need to wait for more results.
And if the rest of the system beyond production is leakier than people think, and in fact there's more of a concern and more of a problem than people think, you hear some people say, so the takeaway from that would be this is not about shale gas. This is about gas, whether it's conventional or unconventional. Would that be a correct? That's correct.
Right. So this first box, shale gas. After that,
okay.
The molecule of gas doesn't make any difference where it is in the system. Once it hits that gathering line, now you're going to be in a shale play, so that's all shale gas, but it's the infrastructure doesn't vary.
And I think the only connection that it has, of course, to shale gas is that because we now are experiencing in the U.S. this sort of, abundance, if you will, right? It's causing policymakers to think about how to use this new supply of natural gas in new ways, whether it's for electricity generation or for transportation or other uses.
Right, and the abundance comes
and
from
so
shale.
increased volumes of gas moving through the system, do exacerbate this concern.
And just a small factual question. When you talked about how this covers, Mark, dry gas production, but not the regs from EPA don't cover associated gas production, gas you get when you drill for liquids. Can you give a sense of how much of the shale gas production we're seeing today comes from the sort of regs that do fall under EPA comes from that do fall under EPA regs, and how much is coming from wells that would not fall under EPA regs?
I want to say right now, and I would need to double check my figures, Jason, but I would want to say right now that associated gas production is now, roughly something like 60%, I believe, of total gas production in the U.S. right now, but I would want to double check that.
And you said some of the wells you guys looked at had green completion technology and some didn't. So would that suggest that even for the associated gas wells that are not covered by the EPA regs, we should feel good that the numbers are lower than people think, or that that's not correct? Okay.
No, that's not what I said. So the ones that the two-thirds of the 27 were covered by the reduced emission completion technology. The one-third that weren't had low potential.
Okay.
So saying is, and the way that Dave Allen explains it after he looked at this in a little more detail, is the companies deployed their equipment effectively. So they understood the sort of conditions of those other wells and said, if I don't have all the equipment to do across the whole spectrum at this point in time, which one do I put it on? The one that I can capture the most from, those that I have less likely. Because now remember, the geologies vary, and some of them won't burp much. Some will burp a lot. And they didn't do it on the wells that have burps less.
Great. Okay. We have about 35, 40 minutes for questions, and there are a lot of questions. So let's go over here, and then we'll come to this area right here. Yeah. So I'll just repeat the question for folks who are watching online, and it was about the strains on the federal workforce that needs to implement these regulations and about the whole distribution system.
Well, so it's a great question, and two thoughts in response. So first of all, as we said, right, we firmly believe that this is an issue of more than just production. So the fact that you're raising the issue of emissions along pipelines is consistent with how we're looking at this, right? We have to look at this entire value chain. And while we're out in the field right now trying to gather emissions data to better understand what the leaks are, and frankly what the opportunities are to reduce the footprint of that infrastructure. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing goes to an important question, which is, regulations on the books are only as good as the resources that are devoted to implementation and enforcement. And this is, quite frankly, a challenge. First of all, as a practical matter, federal air regulations are implemented in partnership with the states. The federal government usually sets the standard, and usually it's a partnership between the feds and the states in terms of both implementation and enforcement. So we need to look not only at the number of federal inspectors that we have, but we have to look at the number of state inspectors that we have. Right? We have been strong advocates, EDF has been strong advocates of making sure that money that's collected in the form of royalties or severance taxes and the like from gas production be channeled back into implementing the regulatory programs that assure the public that this is being done safely. But this is a real challenge, and one, frankly, that public pressure needs to help us with, because allocation of resources during scarce budget times means that people who are vocal in their concerns are the ones who help get the money to where it needs to go. That's the first thing. The second thing is what we are hoping for with this study and other efforts to go out into the field and do emissions data gathering is that the best assurance that we're going to see reduction in emissions is when the public broadly understands what those emissions are and where they're coming from. You're seeing a whole host of new technologies, remote sensing technologies, that allow citizens to go out and do methane emissions monitoring. And what we're hoping to do with our work, in addition to bringing better data into the discussion, is also, frankly, pioneer not only the technologies but the methodologies to use those technologies responsibly, put it in the hands of researchers and educated citizenry so that we're using this data to basically, look over the shoulders of both companies and regulators to make sure that these emissions are going down.
And I'll just add one quick thing. So there's Mark's last point that we're focusing very heavily on this technology piece and how do we develop the sensor systems, because the problem is you can measure just methane, but methane comes from multiple sources. So you have to be careful, and this has gotten some people in trouble, pointing to methane, but yet it's either natural coming from wetlands or sewer gas or other things. So be a little careful. Can we develop cheap, effective systems, technology, so that we don't need to have that person walking around to know what's going on? And those technologies we think are not far off, and when we have them, then we can really implement a really tight regulations.
So there were several questions right here. We have a microphone, actually, so folks watching online can hear the questions. So we'll start just on the aisle there, and we'll keep the questions and the answers brief and try to work through all of them.
My name is Marge. How soon will green completions be enforceable as a state regulation, and will it prevent the aging wells from leaking?
So, as I said, for wells that are primarily gas production, the federal regulations are already in effect. As of today, if you are a unconventional gas producer, you either have to be doing a green completion or you have to be capturing the methane and flaring it. Now, flaring it has its own issues, but at least from a greenhouse gas standpoint, it's preferable to just unmitigated venting. Okay, everyone will have to do green completions by every gas producer will have to do green completions by 2015. Now, right, the question becomes, what about these associated gas producers? There, we need EPA to act to extend the regulation. And by the way, I should have mentioned, Colorado already requires associated gas producers to do green completions. So what we're asking EPA to do is no different from what Colorado already requires all of its gas producers to do, and that's part of the reason why we're confident that this can be done across the spectrum.
And one thing just to add to that, remember the completions is that burp at the beginning. So an old well, unless you're doing a workover, that's relatively low issue, though it still needs to be dealt with, it doesn't apply. That already happened. Whatever was emitted in the completion, and that's in the past. That's the rearview mirror. We don't capture that.
But what you can do for existing wells are things like the pneumatic technology, change that out to go to this low or no bleed pneumatic technology. You can do leak detection and repair. So there are things that we can do at existing wells to reduce their existing footprint. And that was the purpose of my other 2 points.
Let's go to the front row, and then we can pass the mic straight back in a line.
Good morning, Michael LeBrun from Damascus Citizens for Sustainability. A recent study by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Lab in Boulder, Colorado, used airplane flyovers and other techniques that integrate fugitive emissions at a regional scale and that did not rely on industry access. They found emission rates to be 12 to 20 times higher than what you're finding. How do you reconcile those figures with your study?
Sure. So first of all, the reference to Colorado flyovers is actually the work that we've funded, and I will not speak about those results. They're not published. So there was a report that I regret in Nature that talked about, but it's unpublished, so we can't talk about that. There was a paper that they did on Utah, which is published, which shows much higher levels. So we have to look at those, and those are real. There's a real concern, but it's a small geography in one day. So it doesn't alleviate that, but we also have to be common on the metrics. So those isn't just well production, that's also gathering and processing, so it's a larger chunk of it. And they're using a slightly different metric than the numbers up here. Again, not right or wrong, it's just different. So you have to put them in an apples to apples basis. So I don't think using that the common way, it's quite as dramatic a difference as you suggest, but there is a large difference, and that we completely agree, and that's what we have to investigate, and that's why we funded more than a year ago that team to work and produce exactly those and to be honest, I had hoped that they would be releasing those results at the same time as this study. But again, the process is not one we control. It's driven by the researchers, so we're waiting on those. But it's critical. We need to look at it both ways.
Two additional points. One is this fall we hope to be doing some research work in the Barnett Shale, where we will be combining the work that we've been doing, what we call sort of bottom-up, where we're actually on site at a company's well site doing site-specific emissions measurements, simultaneously doing aircraft overflights, right, in an effort to better understand how these two techniques, work together.
And I was just going to add, one of the things you have to understand is the uncertainty analysis. One of the key things in all of this is understanding where your uncertainties are. And you can't, I would argue, and I've had this conversation with the folks who do that work both ways, you need both methods. One is not a substitute for the other. They're complementary. You can't do what we're trying to do collectively as a society, understand that, with one technique or the other, because they tell us different things. And together they give us a much greater picture of what's going on than we could individually. So it shouldn't be pitted as a right, wrong, up, down. These are complementary. And that's how the research community. We've had all those PIs together in the same room, comparing notes, contrasting, comparing. That's where this Barnett came. So they're not opposed results. They're complementary results. They show us something. We're trying to resolve what they show us.
Okay, just behind.
Cesar Penafiel. Do you have any data on the risks of methane leakage as opposed to oil from natural disasters or man-made disasters? The risk of methane leakage for the environment due to that.
Maybe just pass it behind you. We'll take maybe two at a time and keep going because we get a lot of questions. Is that okay? Can we do two questions at a time? Okay, because I see a lot of hands.
So we get a piece of paper and write it down.
My question is, I know that the focus of, Heidi Goggins, Catskill Citizens for Safe Energy. I know the focus of this study is methane emissions. Do you have any plans to study things like VOC emissions in the future? That's my question.
So yes, we are looking at that. We are looking at general issues of air emissions at these sites, and looking now at what kind of studies might be appropriate to do, particularly with a focus on public health. So many of the complaints that you hear from communities that are under siege from gas development have to do with this issue of noxious smells, or suddenly you see increased incidents of respiratory distress. We're talking with a number of schools of public health and exploring ways in which we could design a study that we think would be a credible study to look at this. One thing I should note is all of the technologies that we're talking about here in terms of improving the methane footprint at the point of production are technologies that would have the added benefit of reducing VOCs and air toxics at these sites. And so there's really a twofer here. And it's one of the reasons why we feel so strongly about this work, because we think that this is something that we can do for the global environment, reducing methane emissions, and something tangible that we can do to come to the aid of communities who are most distressed by the activity that's going on at these sites.
Getting back to the previous question, we are not directly involved in looking at natural disaster issues like what happened in Colorado and Weld County, where the infrastructure was damaged by the horrendous flooding that occurred last week. There is some work, not that we're directly involved with, trying to quantify natural leakage. So you do get methane coming out of natural seeps, old wells, a whole source of things, some of it totally natural, unrelated to human activity. And that becomes part of this whole methane budget issue. Is one of the things you have to tease apart is how much is natural background from biological as well as from thermogenic, coming from geological sources. And I would really have to reach out to that community and ask if any of them are working on, are there any basically effectively burps if you have earthquakes in the wrong place and things like that. I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure that anyone's made those measurements.
Just behind our last question, and then we'll go in the back.
First of all, thank you both for an excellent explanation of something that would otherwise be extremely difficult for us to capture. Is there a difference, or have you been able to detect yet a difference, maybe this is part of your phase 3, of leakage from pipelines versus, for example, tanks on trains, all things being equal with regard to the integrity of the facility in both cases? And secondly, as part of your overall study in the full 5 stages of it, will there be any examination of an element of the economics with regard to the industry and the environmental protection, such that to even out what you mentioned as the essential enforcement component, Mark, be leveraged across the vastly different types of players in this market that were mentioned as well, sort of like a universal environmental protection fund, similar to what's used in the telecoms industry, the Universal Service Fund, where those who are reaping wonderful economic benefits because of their great investment can contribute to a fund that helps those who are not reaping those benefits, similarly for enforcement purposes, that then gives the EPA funds to do the enforcement, or gives the state the funds to do the enforcement. Or
well,
whatever.
Getting anything done in Washington right now legislatively is a bit of a trick. But there's a huge opportunity right here in front of us. We are all owners of gas leases that are on federal lands, right? We're all citizens of the U.S., and these are our gas leases on federal lands. We've made the point to the Bureau of Land Management, right, that they have a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate the kind of best practice in terms of reducing and capturing methane that we would hope to see across the industry and across the states. So it may be a trick to get a universal federal fund in place to assist states in funding their enforcement measures, but we certainly can do on federal lands, right, is make sure that the severance taxes that are collected on federal lands, that some of that is recycled back into making sure that whatever production does take place on federal lands does take place using the best technology and making the most effective use of leak detection and repair and other strategies to make sure that we're not losing what's being produced, right? That's an environmental issue, but it's also an economic issue, and frankly, it's a national energy security issue. There's zero reason why we should be wasting this product.
And in terms of just, I don't know. We're not looking at trains right now. I'm not aware that they're doing large quantities of gas.
As a practical matter, that's more an oil question.
Right.
Right. No one is shipping natural gas by rail car, right? But certainly in the oil fields, that is the case.
And one other thing related to that, again, I'm going to come back, recycle and answer, which is having good technology that's cheap and effective becomes critical. So going back to the previous commission of communities, we've been talking with folks about, personal monitor sensors. Can we create small enough, accurate enough, precise enough sensors so that we could really pattern? And that's really the challenge, right? So in the community basis, it's highly heterogeneous. And so it's very difficult to pick that up because you need right now so much equipment that's so expensive it becomes very difficult. If we can get cheaper equipment that can be deployed very broadly and has accuracy, now we can really understand what's going on in a fine enough grain that talks about individuals. And that becomes key in the same with in the enforcement issue. And we think it's not far off. That's not a over the mountain. That's a pretty close up. We think that's very doable in a very short period of time.
So let's go to Professor Gerard and then pass it back to Rose, and we'll get 2 questions in. And where are you going? and we'll take 2 at a time if that's okay, just to make sure we get them all in.
Michael Gerard from the law school. Some of the reports about your study indicated that the industry selected the universe of wells that might be studied, and then the researchers chose from among those wells. How can you be confident that the universe is representative and did not exclude high-error emitting wells?
And just pass it back to Rose.
Brian Lawrence, Oak Cliff Capital. Nice to see you guys. I think you made a great point about the leaks in the production side of this being in the interests of the producers to find, because after all, that's more gas they can sell. But as you move further down your chain into transmission storage, especially into local distribution, it's basically the business model of the distributors and the utilities to disavow leaks and in fact charge for them. I mean, the more than 2 million miles of retail pipeline, if you get into a place that's suburban, it may cost you $1 million a mile to rip up that pipe and replace it. And in places like Washington, D.C., the utility has this thing called gas lost and unaccounted for, which is up to 3% I've seen reported of the gas that comes in from the interstate pipeline, and they actually bill their customers for it, which is the opposite of the incentives, both of those things I've just said. So I guess my question is, as these studies roll out, and I think they're terrific, what is EDF's theory of change against someone where we're talking perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe $1 trillion worth of value to fix?
Mm-hmm. Why don't you take that second one? I'll take the first one.
Sure. So, Brian, let me do yours first, and I'll let Steve then talk about the study. So you're right, okay. When you get further down the value chain, you're talking about basically regulated entities who don't make money selling gas. They make money on the volume of gas moving through their system, and largely, right, the money they make is basically on the capital that they deploy, the infrastructure. So on the one hand, I'd make the argument that because they get rewarded for investing money into their infrastructure, there is some natural incentive for them to want to have the most modern infrastructure because it's rate-based that they can recover on. But you're also right, both in the interstate pipeline system and the local distribution system, companies get what's known as lost and unaccounted for gas, which is a certain amount of gas that goes missing. When you talk to folks in these sectors, there's a variety of reasons that's offered for why gas goes missing. Some of it may be leaks, some of it may be theft, some of it may be imprecise measurement techniques. Any combination thereof, it's a stew. We've been making the argument that we believe that going forward that companies who seek lost and unaccounted for recovery should be required to do regular inspections of their system using state-of-the-art methane emissions monitoring technology. I mentioned that there are these drive-by technologies that are coming to the fore now, and we believe that they are on the cusp of being able to provide real solid data to companies about location of leaks and size of leaks, and that this information can be used to create prioritization of work. We are right now in Con Ed's rate case, where we were talking with them actively about using this technology to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of their pipeline repair and replacement programs. Likewise, we were also talking to PSE&G across the river, who has proposed $1 billion in pipeline replacement. We think that this mapping technology can be an incredibly important tool in helping to prioritize where those leaks are and making sure that whatever dollars are being spent effectively.
And one of the things, and then I'll go to the second question on that is, so we're actively involved in developing these drive-by algorithms. So one of the things that we also saw was the need for this. So we have been putting our own resources into developing them. Not just, it's very easy to say there's methane, and again, it's how much and from where. So you need a system, you need an effective approach to really understand what you're seeing. Going to the previous question on sites selected, there has been a lot of criticism, or I won't say a lot, there's been criticism about the representativeness. So I think there are two separate issues here, and they're getting conflated. So one is, how did the study actually roll out? The study team gave the companies the geography and the time a bit before and said which completions are happening in this geography in this week. Now, when you do the math, they don't have a whole lot to pick from. They had to give them all of them, and then UT told them which one they'll show up at. And they would show up at. And that's all. If you've ever seen pictures of these, this is a lot of equipment. You don't move this around easily. So you don't, decide, oop, they're coming, I'm going to move everything over there. That doesn't work like that. So that would be how it would start. And then when they were there on that site doing the completion, because that was the biggest, hardest part of the study, they would then ask for a list of all the wells that company had within a certain distance. They'd get that list, and then they would tell them which ones they're going to go visit while they are there, because what they would do is they need a big crew to set up the completion. The completions lasted less than a day to a couple of weeks, and in the interim between the sort of beginning and the end when they needed all this staff, that staff would go out and measure, those researchers would go out and measure. All of the companies have asserted positively. We've asked the explicit question. They gave the researchers all the sites that met the criteria that the UT team requested. So I can't do more than that, and they've said explicitly, we gave them everything. These were the criteria. We handed them whatever completions. In terms of, so that's the first. Where's their cherry picking? The companies had no say in which ones. They gave them the list by these criteria. And there was no looking over the shoulder or anything. The UT team controlled that totally. And there was no, we're going to go do it in 2 months. Tell us what you want to do. In terms of readiness, this is 9 companies. The study does not deal with the rest of the universe out there. These 9 companies drilled half the wells. So in terms of the completions, it's a very big piece. It's not all of it. That's why we're also funding flyovers, and we're having the combined campaign that was mentioned in the Barnett, so we can compare and contrast. So did the UT team miss something that's critical to this question? And we have to answer that. We can't address that other half of the completions. We don't. The UT study didn't look at it.
Great. Right here in the front, and then over here.
Hi. Oh, hi. My name is Ruth Hardinger, and I work with Damascus Citizens for Sustainability. And I just wanted you to know that there have been a number of reports about fugitive emissions in urban situations. Boston has done a lot of study. Washington, D.C. had a study, and Damascus Citizens conducted one for 160 miles of pipeline here in Manhattan. And we found that there were emissions of at least 5% of methane, and they were largely gas pipeline leaks. Just note that when they drove out of the city, the leak levels were about 1.8%. So there's a rather big difference between what's happening in Manhattan and what's happening just outside in the rural areas, where gas is not being extracted. So my question to you is, well, I have 2. One, since methane is so incredibly potent in its first years, and this is a very serious moment in climate change, we're heading toward a tipping point. Why are we, we definitely need to do something about methane emissions, which I understand you're trying to do, but I think this is going very slowly and can slow processes down a lot. To repair this infrastructure is going to be enormously expensive. And, I don't get how this can possibly work. But let me also say that I would like to share the Damascus Citizens Sustainability Report with you, which also has measured the mixing layer.
Do you want to get one more question and then answer? Or?
Sure.
Well, Jason, one thing I don't want to lose the teachable moment here, though.
Okay.
Just everyone take a look to your left.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
All right.
Number 6 oil.
Right. So we are trying to fix that. Okay. Which I would imagine is both a climate harm, but it is certainly a harm to the health of every one of us living in this city. And so part of the reason why we're engaged in this is because we recognize the near-term value that natural gas can play in addressing issues like that. I think your more fundamental question is where are we going as a society with our energy policy, right? And clearly, right, we want to move to a world that is much more reliant on renewables than we have today. And there are various studies out there about how quickly one can get from here to there. And we can argue about whether that transition period is 10 years or 20 years or 80 years. But for however long that transition period is, right, we need to do everything possible to make sure that we're minimizing harm to communities from the production of natural gas, and those risks are real. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything possible to minimize the loss of methane in production and distribution, because as Steve said, right, the climate feels those impacts acutely, particularly in the early years of the life of those molecules in the atmosphere. So I don't think there's no argument between us in terms of where we're trying to go ultimately, right? But what we are trying to do is make sure that however long it takes to get there, we're doing everything possible to minimize environmental harms on that trip.
So, and one thing is the estimate from just the reduction in that number 6 in the city is 800 deaths avoided in New York. So, I mean, these are tangible. And I do want to, I want to comment since Mark started. We have to be very careful. I don't know your 5% number, but pardon? Yeah, I can't judge it, but I do know the literature. And one of the things we're trying to do is there's no good estimate of leakage rate from any city right now. We're funding that in Boston. So the point is that you need to, there's some new technologies that have been developed to integrate that into an effective measure. And so we have to be really careful that we don't get, again, apples and various fruit all mixed up together. And we can talk offline about the specifics of your study. So we are absolutely there. We are using methods across the country. They have completed their work. They're preparing the report. It'll be submitted for publication, talking about leakage rates in 10 different cities in the U.S. We're doing at the same time. There's a very, very detailed study being done in Boston that will be released for the first time, getting a good percentage. So we completely agree. We need to know those numbers, but we also have to make sure it's based on sound science. And I'm not saying what you did isn't, but I do know the literature pretty effectively, and there hasn't been much of this done, if any, up till now.
I think it's fair to say that you're going to see regional differences. I mean,
wide differences.
We know the infrastructure. We know the gas delivery infrastructure in the Northeast is old. Okay, and it's logical to conclude that old infrastructure is going to be leakier infrastructure. We don't know how much. Okay, but we do know that yes, it will be expensive to fix that infrastructure. But it starts with having some better understanding as to where the leaks are coming from to be able to then target those dollars most effectively, and that's what we mean by using this advanced technology. Okay. I don't think it's fair to say that simply because Con Ed has 1,000 miles of cast iron pipe, that all of it needs to be replaced. But what we do need to know is we need to know which part of the system is leakiest, and therefore where should we focus ratepayer dollars so that we can make sure that we're fixing the worst leaks first.
Okay, we have less than 10 minutes left. Let's get the question here, and then gentlemen over here, we'll take both together and then give you a chance to respond.
Hi, my name is Shuo Yang, a recent graduate. I have a big question. What's the new in the phase 2 studies? That's in general. In details, for example, following the question from this gentleman about the well size, I have a question about these companies you work with. The 9 companies, if I understand correctly, they are major companies, players like Anadarko, Shale, Chevron. They have better resources, updated technology. I wonder in phase 2 if you cooperate with smaller players, maybe how different result coming up. Thanks for answering.
And then just in the back.
Sure.
Let's just get one more question in,
Okay.
and then take both, just because I'm worried about time.
My name is Dan Pinkel. A question of how much, suppose we do a good job of improving practices in the United States, how is that likely to diffuse to the rest of the world, since that's where a lot of this gas is going to be produced?
Well, it's my colleague Drew Nelson, and Dave Allen, the author of the study, are this week in Europe, touring Europe, basically presenting the results of this study across Europe, where they are looking at increased use of natural gas, and they are looking at shale gas development. So the short answer to your question is we hope that the work that we're doing here in the U.S. is in fact influential around the world, and we have every reason to think that it is. I'll be in Europe, the third week in October, also talking about this issue.
And we've done briefings for international delegations about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and encouraging them to get ahead of the curve.
To your question about the players in the study, I mean we had 9 companies that stepped forward and were willing to participate in this study, not necessarily knowing what the results would be, and being surprised by some of the results. Okay, higher fugitive emissions, higher emissions for pneumatics. That's not what the industry expected. And we applaud those 9 companies for being willing to participate in what was a science-based exercise. We feel strongly, and we're glad that they did too, that getting real data into the discussion about this important issue was key to transitioning from a finger-pointing exercise to one where we can now start talking about what should be done, what needs to be done. Not all of the companies were of the size of XTO, but as I said, they were, as you're right, most of them were on the larger side. This is an industry with 3,000 to 7,000 different producers. And again, the only way we're going to be sure that we get the kind of excellent results that we have a right to expect from this industry is when we're setting some kind of regulatory floor that they're all complying with.
And so then, and one other thing, so using this campaign that Mark just talked about that we'll be doing soon, where we're doing a lot of drive-by flyovers, a whole lot of technologies, we can try and get at that. So we are also looking at wells that aren't part of the 9 and looking at production and trying to integrate it together. So absolutely, we need to know that answer. You know, what are the full spectrum of companies and what are their practices?
Mark, is part of the answer to that what you said before, that EPA will require all companies, big and small, to use this technology for
completions.
For completions.
And on the natural gas side. But on the pneumatics and the equipment, we have to ask the fundamental question, is the pneumatics and equipment look different for others in the 9?
Okay, let's take 2 more questions, and then that might bring us to the end over here. And then, is there one more? Yep, right here.
My name is Meredith Dillon. I appreciate that so much work you're putting into trying to make this a safe industry, but it concerns me that the conversation never includes renewable energy, and I would love to see Columbia put on a similar forum on the state of renewable energy. We hear a lot about natural gas. There's so much money being put into this, and I worry that the reason we're not hearing about renewable energy is that there's not money in it, that wind and solar is free once the infrastructure is established.
Well, I could list the number of events we've had on renewable energy and climate change, but we'd be here past our closing time. But anyway, we're here to talk about this topic today. We have lots of events on a whole range of topics.
Our colleague Cheryl Roberto would be welcome to participate in that, and we could talk quite a bit about all that EDF is doing to promote renewable energy development, modernize our grid, make the market opportunities for microgrids and distributed generation, market-based demand response. All of this is part of the energy future.
And the scale of our work is equally as great in that area as it is in this. So it's not as if this is the big and that's the small. They're both large efforts. We think we need to do both.
Last question.
Michael LeBrun again. Is your technology able to distinguish between biogenic and thermogenic gas releases? And if so, are you measuring that, and why? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Great question. So the difference between something that's coming out of, to repeat the question, can we tell methane that's coming out of a wetland or sewer gas that, or even from landfill material underneath that long ago was forgotten that it existed, and that coming from natural gas. So yes, we are always, in all of these studies, worried about the difference between biogenic and thermogenic. And even more so, among thermogenic, you have natural sources of methane, in some case coal bed methane seeps. That's something we spend a lot of time worrying about and trying to develop, and how much. The trouble is that analytically it takes more energy to do that, more effort to do that. So we have to figure out when you need to do it and when you don't need to do it. So in the case of the UT study, because they're going right to the source, they can be fairly confident that it's thermogenic, not biogenic sources.
Then I have a quick follow-up question. As you know, the industry likes to distinguish between those two, and it is impossible that a well that's designed to stimulate thermogenic production can also stimulate biogenic fugitive releases.
I'm not. We're going to have to talk offline. I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but absolutely. So we're doing the flyover work, and a lot of the work we're doing isotopic work. A lot of our teams are doing isotopic work. They're doing, it's a big issue. It's a big concern. A lot of the teams, but again, if we're going to try and make it routinized and be able to get ubiquitous data, then you can't do everything all the time. So figuring out when you need to do that and not is one of the key issues that the many researchers are working on.
All right. Well, we always at Columbia at CEPA try to teach students about how to do good, rigorous, evidence-based policy analysis, and you can't do that without good data. So we really appreciate EDF's effort to undertake this effort. The future reports we look forward to seeing, and hopefully you'll come back to talk about them here as well and help make sure that they're accurately understood, regardless of how they may be reported or people in the public may be using them. And so I learned a lot today. This was really helpful, and I appreciate all of your coming and being here, people online as well. Thanks, Mark Brownstein and Dr. Stephen Hamburg, for being here.